Strive and Thrive is a collection of discussions featuring guests from various fields, focused on guiding entrepreneurs in creating businesses that excel in every aspect: people, planet, and profit. Throughout the series, you can join us, Ramesh and Mike, as we explore relevant topics with our guests which can help businesses thrive.
Ramesh and I met while I was supporting a client transforming their business, and I needed finance director support and reached out to him and his team. Since then, we've become good friends who share a passion for business and entrepreneurship. If you like today's discussion, then you want to subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify channels.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our latest episode with Kate Mercer of Leaders Lab. I've known Kate for a number of years and have always really valued Kate's advice and expertise. She's someone I love having kind of discussions about business with. Kate's a coach, a facilitator and trainer with over 30 years experience and is focused on helping her clients improve communication, building real teamwork and streamlining working practices within businesses. Kate's also the author of a brilliant book. Here it is, A Buzz in the Building, How to Build and Lead a Brilliant Organization. So Kate, welcome. In this episode, we're going to cover mindsets and skills required to build an effective people-based organization.
Hello, Kate. Welcome to Strive and Thrive. Thanks for joining us today. So tell us a bit about your journey and how you've got to where you've got to and where you've written your book.
Wow. Well, it's quite a long journey, actually. It goes back about 30 years now. But I started out in my last proper job as a trainer. I worked in the training department, or the HR department, the training section of Johnson & Johnson. And when I left J&J to join my husband in his consultancy business, it seemed obvious to me that I should just do training. And with a lot of clients from the J&J world, I ran a successful training business for some years, but I began to get really disillusioned with training because you can have a really lovely time training. People love learning new skills and they really enjoyed the courses. But I began to be increasingly aware that when they went back into their working environments, it was like a bucket of cold water. You know, the people they worked for hadn't been on the courses. So they were inspired by a version of best practice that wasn't being practiced by their management. And gradually over the years, I got more and more interested in working directly with the management, which meant not really accessing the business through the training department, but accessing it through going straight to the board. And over recent years, that's really become a abiding interest in smaller and medium-sized businesses because the world of the corporate world, well, I've wanted to keep my business small. And the corporate world is looking for big players who can do global programs. And I really love I love SMEs. I just love working with them. I love the fact that, you know, with the average SME, you can get everybody in one room. And people can't sit up and say to you, something can't be done because everybody's in one room. They can do anything they like. There's not that much restriction on what they can do. So it's much more fun. It's more fun. And that's how I ended up writing the book, because I realized that people tend to regard the world of business as somewhat binary. You know, you're either a startup, a small business, or you're a corporate with lots and lots of structures and processes. And that's actually not true. There's this enormous area in between of the SME, which needs to be more structured than the startups, but doesn't need to be as structured as the corporates. It needs a lighter, more elegant level of structure. And that's what I'm interested in working with people to develop in their organizations. So I wrote the book as the textbook, really, for that process.
Really interesting. And I see lots of organizations that are trying to go through that phase of growing and feeling awkward at that stage, is what do I need to build and what process do I need to put in place just to sort of help navigate that. How do you define an SME when you're talking about it?
I went back to the official definition, which is something like an organization of between 10 and 250 people.
Yeah.
Turning over a certain amount, which escapes me for the moment, because they're not defined. They're defined by a mindset and a set of thought processes, rather than by the exact turnover they make or the exact financial. Even they're not necessarily defined by the size. I've found some very big organizations with an SME mindset.
Yeah.
So to me, it is much more an example. It's much more a mindset you need to get into than a specific set of sizes, but probably between 0 and 250 people is.
So touching on mindsets, I like that word. I was going to say what are their biggest challenges, but I think I'm going to flip on mindsets. What's your kind of view on the mindsets that you're seeing where they need support from your book and yourself?
It's really at that stage where they shift from being a startup organization, a very small, intimate organization, starts around the kitchen table or in somebody's garage, usually staffed by people they know, so either family or friends or a bunch of mates. And people get very excited at that stage. It's a very exciting stage of a business. But as they grow, and many businesses do want or need to grow, they carry on trying to use that type of management, that type of leadership, as the organization shifts into what I would say is the next phase. The next phase is more of a consolidation level of the business. And the mindset needs to shift there from simply running a business to actually growing an organization. Yeah. And that's something that I find many founder owners of SMEs are fairly blind to, that they go on focusing on the outward aspects of running a business, getting the product out the door or the service out the door, getting the money in, improving their processes for doing that. But as the business gets bigger, it gets more unwieldy on the people side. Yeah. And they need to shift their attention to actually growing the kind of organization they'd like to grow. Otherwise, they'll get the one they get. It'll just evolve in whatever direction it evolves. And they generally end up with a load of complaints about it at that point.
Do you see it as a people challenge as much as a process challenge? Because a lot of what I see is organizations try and implement process, whereas a lot of it, I feel it's people dynamics and behaviors. And
that's very interesting, because I think you need processes on the people side. I think you need a clear operating framework for leading and managing your people.
Okay.
For example, I've had a client recently. I started some work with to put a small amount of structure in a very small company, but because the MD wants to leave in a few years' time, we're starting the process of creating a management team and creating some management structure. And I mentioned having monthly management meetings. And he said, really? I mean, do we really need to meet? We're all in the same office anyway. Do we really need to meet monthly? And I said, yes, because that is your opportunity to work on the organization, on the business, rather than in the business. And that is the essential shift at this stage of a business. If he wants his organization, and it's an employee-owned organization, so he does want it to persist beyond his leaving it. So he will leave it, and they will still be paying for it for 3 to 5 years beyond when he leaves the organization. For that reason, it needs to exist, and because he's very proud of it and he wants his legacy to persist. So he needs to put in a clear, simple operating framework for operating the people side of the business.
I love how you talk about on rather than in the business. And I think that's something that I particularly find challenging for what I do as well in my business, because you're in it, you love it. And then suddenly you're like, have I really reflected and looked on it? I think you talk about framework, but do you need to mentor that individual as well to go through that experience of what that's going to psychologically change for them?
Yes. I mean, it will inevitably change a number of psychological elements, and I think even the clients who see that quite clearly and are willing to accept the operating framework, which of course is meetings. It's meetings on the business as well as in the business. It's meetings, it's roles, it's accountabilities. It's getting everything like that out on paper and into manuals and processes.
Yeah.
That's kind of the easy bit, although they haven't necessarily thought of doing it themselves. But that's often a bigger challenge, even if they're open to it, than they think. So one of my biggest challenges is, even with a founder who says he wants to leave in 2 to 3 years' time, actually helping them let go sufficiently so that they will be able to leave in 2 to 3 years' time. Because if they keep on holding all the reins themselves, getting their sleeves rolled up and mucking in when things need doing, people won't learn to operate the business. They won't learn to run that operating framework the way he does.
Yeah.
Or she does. And when they leave, then it's going to fall flat on its face, and nobody wants that to happen.
What about yourself, Ramesh? Have you worked for businesses that are going through this teething pains and experiences, and what's your view?
Yeah, definitely. As I'm sure, Mike, as you've described, 100%. I think lots of common features, right, which Kate, I think, is really excellent at kind of summarising and distilling. But for me, often there is a lack of a clear plan and strategy. There's an unclear division of roles and responsibilities. And I think, to be fair, practically that's difficult in a really small business, isn't it? If we're going at the, towards the lower end of SMEs, I've been, I've worked in very small businesses that have grown to lots of employees. But at the stage where you might have 10, 15, 20 employees, you have to multitask. You have to do lots of different things, particularly at senior level. And, that's a challenge, isn't it? Especially as you then have to evolve as you grow, as Kate describes, to become more effective. And it's, I suppose, giving people that pathway and understanding of how they can change to evolve. So, I've said that lots of times. Sorry,
it's interesting what you say, though, Ramesh, about roles and accountabilities, because I think you're right that, small businesses roles tend to evolve. In fact, they tend to evolve around the skills of the people you've already got. And it evolves around people's skills generally. So that, Mike, you mentioned earlier, taking time to think about the business and where it's going and what your strategy is. Ramesh, you mentioned lack of planning. Those things aren't generally what people learn to do in startup businesses. They learn to, pack things and catch things and sort things out and put right messes and all of that sort of thing.
Firefight effectively, right?
Firefighting, yeah, and they learn to, and it's all activity based. What you won't get if you don't have a conversation about roles and accountabilities is that level of thinking about what is the ultimate deliverable of your role. So you'll get people who will, answer the phone if it rings. They'll sell to somebody if somebody rings up and asks for a sale, but they won't think about where am I taking the selling? What are my targets? Where am I going with this? Unless they have time to do that. And you talk about, I don't consider a 10 or 15 or 20 person business a very small one. To be honest, that's the point at which I would say it's crucial that you start thinking about roles, because you can no longer rely on doing it, just doing it the way you did it when you were in a startup stage. It's surprising what comes out of that role and that role conversation when you have it with a group of people who've been managing their business for a long time. And they will uncover all the gaps and overlaps in their roles.
Do you think some of the challenge is the actual founder in this case? Do you think that's a lot of where the problems stem from, or do you think it's more endemic to the structure that they're putting in place?
I think it's more the founder. I don't see many small businesses that aren't directed and led by a powerful character or characters who ultimately hold all the decision-making power and all the reins themselves.
And do you see
And
the
I
trigger?
think-
The trigger there. Do you see therefore the trigger for those individuals, either individual or team, is that they want to leave or they want to change the business, or could it be multifaceted? They want to grow. They need to look at a
it's
different market,
multifaceted.
whatever it might be.
It's multifaceted.
Okay.
I'm involved, probably more by chance, more by luck than judgment at the moment, with a few businesses where somebody wants to leave.
Yeah.
But actually, no, it's often because I mentioned earlier that that's when the complaints start. So they start in this kind of honeymoon glow of, oh, we're all mates together and it's such fun running our business or our family business. And then they come to a point where it's like, well, why does everything end up on my desk? Why I have even had a client come back from holiday to find a note on her desk saying we've run out of sugar in the kitchen. It's like running a bunch of kids. Why am I? And that's when the complaints start. So that wasn't somebody who wanted to leave her business. That was somebody who just couldn't understand why she was the one who ended up, I don't know, it was quite trivial things, emptying the bins or moving the clocks on in spring. Nobody else thought about doing it because nobody else owned. She didn't realize that nobody else had the same level of ownership of the environment and the business running as she did. What made her a really good client was my question immediately after she'd sounded off a bit about this was, what part do you feel you've played in this ending up this way? And she said, well, I am a bit of a control freak. And that's it. It's a perfect client. She knew. So she had inadvertently created the very set of circumstances that she didn't want to have in her company. And that's why I think it's important to talk about roles, because she was inadvertently and with the best will, the kindest heart in the world, stepping into everybody's roles and just taking away any need for them to take accountability. Sorry, Ramesh, you were going to say
not at all. It's good stuff, Kate. And actually, this is really because one of the key questions that I identified in your book, and this is covering this quite nicely, was, are you managing or operating?
Yes.
That is one of your key questions. And absolutely, I can really identify with this from my experience. And I'm sure many business owners will tell you they do struggle with that, right? So what you've talked about, they're running the business, but they need to step away. They need to manage the business effectively.
Yeah, so they need to grow the organization. They need to be able to hand over the running of the business to their people.
Absolutely. So can you share your top kind of insights or tips in terms of how they might be able to do that?
Ooh. What, to step away from getting their sleeves rolled up and getting stuck in?
Yeah.
Well,
so at a very high level, without going into obviously the amazing detail of your book as to how to, the structured approach, how would you, just bullet point, the approach you would recommend?
I think it comes back to roles and accountabilities, to be honest. I think that it's very natural, and there's nothing wrong with business owner founders who have come up from a very small business and who find themselves operating rather than managing. It's natural. That's why they started the business. Usually they're some kind of technical expert. They're an accountant or a web designer, or, they're the person with all the technical skills. And now they're gradually bringing on a team to deliver whatever the product or service is. So there's nothing wrong, but it comes to a point where the organization won't get beyond a certain point or will become unwieldy and inefficient if they don't shift their attention away from the operating and onto the managing of the business. So one of the first things I do is simply have a conversation with that person and the entire leadership team about this sequence of growth stages in a business, because they typically have gone way beyond the first growth shift before they realize that things are going wrong. And they can't understand. They've got the same group of people, the same business, the same values, the same everything, but suddenly people aren't pulling together. People are getting disaffected. It's not working so well. Everything ends up on their desk. And they can't understand what's happening. What's happening is a perfectly natural stage in business development. So they're not doing anything wrong. What they need to do is turn their attention to something else. And they need to turn their attention to working on the business rather than in the business, which means they need to bring people on to work in the business. That requires a conversation about roles in the business. And that conversation, which is, is a very straightforward, facilitated conversation to redesign the roles, brings up just about every conversation that needs to be had in the business. So it brings up conversations about, but I thought that was your job. They thought it was my job. All of that gets talked about. Any little frictions get talked about because they float to the surface, and you end up with a team who has a set of roles that dovetail like that really neatly, that there's no gaps, there's no overlaps, but more than that, they have gone through it all as a group, so that it's built the team in the process. And everybody in that team knows what everybody's role is, and they know that everybody knows what their role is. So there's no hiding from the accountability.
Amazing, Kate.
It's done at high level. Yeah, it's done at high level. Yeah, in terms of deliverable outputs, not activity. Everybody knows what the activities are. What they haven't had a conversation about is deliverable outputs.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. That's really helpful. One of the things I really liked at the beginning of the conversation, which you talked about, was when you were describing your passion for SMEs. And that definitely was something I really identify with. And I know Mike does as well. And it was a really nice description. With an SME, often, you can bring all the key people into one room and you can be agile and flexible. And I love that. So I think that's a really important thing to say, isn't it? If you are in the business of kind of helping growing businesses, you need to have that passion and that understanding. But yeah, that ability for these businesses to turn on their heels very quickly and make some pretty big decisions quickly is quite exciting, isn't it? But going back to your book, Kate, one of the things I liked about it was the fact that you kind of categorize different stages of SME businesses, right? I think you have 1G, 2G, 3G, and I think the G stands for generation, for second, third generation. Do you mind talking us through what each generation of business is, and how essentially each type of category impacts the business in terms of its challenges?
Absolutely.
And opportunities.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So businesses start as a startup, right? You're sitting around your kitchen table, or you're making widgets in your garage. At that stage, it has various features which many people who've started a business will know. It's exciting. Everybody's excited. It's fun. You're usually working with family or friends or people who've got enrolled in your vision because they've dropped by and they've seen what you're doing and said, can I come and work for you, or whatever. So it's an exciting phase. It's characterized by a lot of energy, a lot of all hands to the pump, 24/7 working. And typically communication works quite well at that stage because you are all around the kitchen table, or you're all in the same room together. You hear what's going on. You hear if somebody's dropped a ball and you can catch it. You hear if a customer doesn't understand what's going on and you can go and put it right. So that's, fairly easy to manage. And people will tend to use their existing social skills to manage a business like that. A lot of people will talk about that business as being like a family. And the leaders of business will often draw on their experience as parents or parental characters in their family to run the business. And that's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. It's a perfectly valid way to run a business. And many small businesses don't move beyond that stage. They run as a little family business with a slightly ad hoc way of getting work done and a slightly ad hoc way of recruiting for many, many years. It's perfectly successful.
And that's what you describe as first generation or toddler stage, I believe.
Yeah, I started calling them toddler, teenager, and grown up. But I think one of the problems with calling it toddler, teenager, and grown up is those are all loaded terms, and people don't like being described as toddlers or teenagers. They all like being described as grown ups, which was quite interesting because that was the business that I'm not so interested in. I actually, corporates can manage themselves and they can go to the big players to get their people development work done. But it's these small businesses that have generally managed by people who've come up from the bottom rather than down from the top in big businesses that don't have this concept of how organizations work because they haven't worked in an organization. They've started as a not organization and grown into an organization. So then you get to that stage where it seems to be running out of steam. I described it that, why are they all waiting for me to do things? Why does it all end up on my desk? Why is it like running a bunch of kids? And you can bet your life at that stage, the bunch of kids are probably saying, why is he always meddling into my work? Why doesn't she just leave us alone to get on with it? So they're all falling out with each other a little bit. And that's a sign that something needs to change. Either you need to reset yourself as a family business or you need to move on. And what you need to do to move on is to start to recognize as a leader that the business is actually becoming an entity in its own right. It's a living entity. It's turned into an organization, not just your business. And it will do things if you don't actively take control of it and manage it. It will do things that you're not too happy with. So people will go off at tangents, or you'll get little pockets of complaint and disaffection in the business, or you'll start, things will go wrong and you'll start losing clients. Things will happen that wouldn't be happening if you were actually starting to operate more as more working on the business than in the business, basically. So once it's now this living entity, it has needs of its own. And I think that's one of the major mindset shifts between the first generation stage and the second generation stage. At the first generation stage, it's a bunch of individuals working together, working very closely together, and using their social skills to be very good mates and so on. But what they're not doing is they're not putting in semi-formal communication structures to operate the organization as an entity in its own right. And I'll stop there to see if I'm making sense.
No, absolutely. I do love the categories, and as I said, I can identify so many of the characteristics there. Mike, does this all kind of resonate?
Yeah, I want to touch on it, and I don't want to argue with you because I agree, but I also think I'm seeing a different business dynamic at the moment with people working more remotely, people running part-time jobs,
yes,
and corporate jobs, startups that can be 3 or 4 people that grow really fast and gain lots of money very quickly, and then they're jumping sort of categories. So I think your principles still apply, but do you think the dynamic of what businesses are like at the moment is evolving, and that will sort of different problems exist because of that?
Yes, I really do. I think I would say this, wouldn't I? Because it's, I believe this very powerfully, but I think it calls for the need for the sorts of things I've been talking about even more.
Yeah.
Because if you've got people working remotely, I always wince when I see certain government ministers who say, this organization, the civil service, is only going to work if everybody comes back into the office so we can keep our eye on them. The only way you can get productivity is if people come back into the office. That's a sign that they're not being managed effectively. And you can mask ineffective management by having everybody in one office, because you still get a certain amount of that effect of, people being able to just knock on each other's door and sort things out. If you're working remotely, you must know what the purpose of your job is. You must be talking to your manager on a very regular basis to make sure that what you're doing is still in line with what the strategy of the organization is and what the plans of the organization are. So that need for a clear operating framework is even more important, I believe. And I think you're right. There are tiny businesses that mushroom very fast, and I've worked with a couple of them. They still need to work on roles, accountabilities, and an operating framework sooner rather than later, I think.
And if someone doesn't ask this question on LinkedIn while we're live, they'll certainly ask it me offline. Do you think technology and some of the changes that are going on, everyone talks about AI at the minute, but some of the technology advancements will change any of your sort of conclusions or approaches and mean organisations can scale faster and work in a different way, perhaps?
I think, yes. I think the principles are still there, but I'm having to change the way I work with clients because of technology, because now we have the capacity to have remote meetings, for example. It does call into question, does your consultant really need to get on a train and come up to London and call everybody together in one room to talk to them? And I am having to think very hard to distill the crucial elements of my model, so that I can help get them across, even if I'm, working at least, say, every other month in a remote meeting. I think there are still some procedures, some processes, some conversations that you do need to have face to face. But I think we as consultants do ourselves a disservice with our clients if we insist that every conversation has to be face to face, because they themselves are working in an environment where they're having to adapt what they do to a more remote world. And I think we have to too.
Do you see any
it's forcing
interesting...
us to be more precise about the things that do need to be done face to face and the things that can be handed over. Yeah,
I 100% agree with that. Do you see any interesting signals or trends that are going on that will change some of your approaches in the future, or the things that businesses are doing differently that's novel and interesting, and dynamics that you see changing in the coming years?
The thing that springs to mind is a greater degree of, you could call it sophistication in people who are employed. They do want to know, they want more meaning in their work now. And this may be following COVID. They've all had a really good think, or we have all had a really good think about whether our work serves us, and whether that's and it's not as crude as, does it serve me to work from home or in the office? It does my work give me a sense of achievement and meaning? So, and I've banged on for 30 years about the importance of management giving people a sense of achievement and giving them lots of feedback and so on. It's now more crucial than ever that we meet people's personal needs. And, I went to a talk a little while ago, a conference where there was a talk on Gen Z and their needs. And what was very striking, because they had a couple of Gen Z people there leading the session, and they said to me afterwards, we're really quite shocked by how negatively business owners regard our generation. And we see that all the time. I think as consultants, we hear it from our clients all the time, with people who have, interviewed somebody or called somebody for interview, never bothered to turn up, or even appointed somebody who never turned up on the first day, or interviewed a young person who's tried to dictate their conditions for taking the job before they've even got the job. And I think, it's easy to say, they just need to be brought into line. They're trying to say something about what they want from their working world. And I don't see why we shouldn't meet them halfway. I mean, personally think turning up for an interview, if you've been booked for one, is probably non-negotiable. And, you know, we can have those conversations. But there are some things that people are trying to say that they need from work these days that business leaders aren't supplying.
Yeah.
What do you think those are, Kate? If you were to distill that, what do you think people are? I mean, you have touched on it, but yeah, you know, are there 2 or 3 things in particular you think people really want?
They want to belong. They want to feel important. They're not necessarily senior, but they want to feel important. They want to know that what they're doing is meaningful and is appreciated. And that's not so hard to offer people. I'm actually a bit of a process geek myself, and I do think that people need a really clearly defined job. Because if you've got a really clearly defined job with clearly defined outputs, not activities, outputs, and clearly defined measures, then you've got the basis of a human relationship there. But then the manager mustn't rely on that job description just to give the person satisfaction. But you can then have a regular meeting where you can go, look, we said you should achieve this, or we agreed you would achieve that. You've done it. Well done. That's what people need. They need human contact in their job, but you do need structure underlying it so that the human contact isn't just social skills. It's a seriously professional skill to be able to manage someone else and provide them with something that's not just a pat on the back.
It's getting that balance right between being supportive but also being challenging.
Yes. And if you are being supportive, and if the person is generally doing pretty well, to actually discipline yourself as their manager to define precisely what they're doing well and why it's so good and what effect it has on other people. Not just go jolly. I had a manager once in Johnson & Johnson, who I hope isn't watching, but I was desperate for input when I came over from the world of education into the world of business in my early 30s. And I seemed to be doing all right. And I kept going to my manager and saying, can you tell me how I'm doing? And he'd say, no need to have the conversation, Kate. You're doing brilliantly. I mean, everybody likes you. You've really hit the ground running. You seem to be doing fine. We don't even need a conversation about it. You're doing fine. And after the first time when I thought, oh, that's not bad. After the 6th time, I was hungry to know what of all these things I was apparently doing right, I was actually doing right and what I should do more of. So we can be very sloppy if we think people are doing a good job, that we just don't say, the thing I really, really like about how you did that work was this. And that's because it made it possible for me to do that. That people will never forget feedback like that.
For me, my takeaway from what you're saying, I could harp on about purpose and my nervousness about how people use the word purpose. But my takeaway from what you're saying, and I like it a lot, and I agree with it, is you can help individuals in their roles have that engagement and enjoyment regardless of the broader purpose thing that everyone talks about. And I think what you're saying is making it more individualistic and more important to those individuals to experience.
Yes.
And I think that really cleverly touches on what you've talked about growing as a business as well. And one of the things that you raised earlier that I'm curious about is founders tend to be the energy and the creative energy of an organization, and often their teams feel frustrated or a little bit trapped as well. Do you see that dynamic and how to navigate that kind of thing?
Yes. Founders of businesses tend to be fairly strong, charismatic personalities. They tend to have a lot of energy and to hold the energy. And I think, therefore, they do tend to recruit people who are natural followers. That does sound it's a bit sweeping, but I think there's an element of that in there. So that when you come to the moment where you might lose your founder, as some of my clients are at the moment, you can see the founder looking around for, well, who else has got the spark? Who else could possibly do what I do? And the real catch-22 is that while they're there, that spark won't show up in someone else.
Yeah, good.
So, I'm always my plea is always in my business, and I often get brought in when it's already off the rails a bit and needs pulling back into line. But please bring me in, 3 or 4 years before before all the things have started going wrong, before you want to leave the business, before you want to make the big change or the big push, because the whole thing feels to me sometimes like you take a team and its leader, and you push the leader upstairs, and you pull the team up after it, so that the leader gets pushed up and out of the way a bit. We give them a different role, which is, generally speaking, more upward and outward looking. Being a role model, being an ambassador for the organization, looking for new opportunities, that sort of thing. Because they've been doing too much. They've been squashing the creativity and the energy of their team. Get the leader out of the way, give the team clear role accountabilities, and see who steps up. Because actually, I think people are often much more creative than they think. And if they've worked in the organization for a long time, they have a very good sense of what it needs. But they need that new, more sophisticated operating framework to allow that to come out.
I really agree with your point there, Kate, as well, that it's, getting to this stage doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, right? It's a gradual process that takes a lot of time and it takes investment. So yeah, I totally support your perspective that it takes years to get there. So start early.
Yes, I'd say for, a founder leaving a small business, at least 3 years to see if anybody's stepping up, to get the management team working really well together, to allow the founder to try leaving the business for longer and longer periods of time, to make sure nothing falls over, all of that you need at least 3 years for that, minimum.
Absolutely. So Kate, what are the, with all of your experience and all of the different kind of clients you've worked with and supported, you must have some really interesting stories. So can I ask you maybe to give us, or to share, some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen and how you've dealt with that?
Oh, gosh. Hold on a minute. I'll have to have a think. Biggest mistakes.
Or something that's kind of really surprised you, that you've had to go, okay, right, think about this, roll up the sleeves, and how do I navigate this? With all the kind of support and advice you are giving these businesses, you must encounter some quite interesting scenarios.
I do, actually. I had I'm just thinking of one where I went in, because it's probably pretty obvious that the framework I'm talking about, I honestly think people communicate better when they've got a clear framework to communicate around. Actually, to be honest, I believe that goes for families as well. It goes for all kinds of organizations and football teams and all sorts of organizations. So the framework's really important. And I very often start with the roles and accountabilities of the top team, as I've made clear. So, and I went into work with a small organization some years ago, and the presenting issues were all the usual ones: people behaving like a bunch of kids, lots of backstabbing, people falling out with each other, misunderstandings. And I usually say, let's start with the framework, because it's obviously all a bit of a muddle here. And that way you don't have to say to a team, we're going to sort out all your people, all your issues and all your concerns with each other. You just go in and say, we're going to do this nice concrete exercise of redefining roles. And more often than not, even what founders will tell me are, severe personality clashes will disappear in the process. because actually it was a lack of framework. So I walk in confidently to this one company to encounter a room full of people who, I kid you not, looked like this. And I thought, this is not good. This hasn't been set up well. And I thought, well, okay, I'll start, because we say we're going to look at your roles. So we'll start the process. I'll just go around the table and ask you your names. And I asked the first woman her name, sitting next to me on my right. So just to say your name and how long you've worked with the company. She went, oh, no. I'm not having any of these, trainer games. I'm psychological, whatevers. I'm not answering any questions. And I went, oh gosh, I'm sorry. Oh, well, what do I call you? She said, Angela. That's a fake name, by the way. No, Angela. And I said, how long have you been with the company? And she said, 22 years. I said, fine, thank you, Angela, next. So we went around the table. By the end of the table, it was obvious I was not going to get any work done that morning. And in a way, I quite like ones like that, because it's in my training anyway to be able to handle those situations. So I just said, okay, everybody, time out. What's going on here? This is not how I normally, I'm not coming to make my life miserable. Let's just, and one of them said, well, it could well have been Angela, actually, said, well, some people around this table don't trust other people. And I said, well, are you talking about yourself? And she said, well, maybe. And I said, well, who don't you trust? And we were off. And all we did all day was just unpick what had gone wrong in the team. We never got as far as doing the roles in that thing. But by the end of the day, we had some hugs and some resolutions and some tears. And by the end of the day, people had really at least got to a point where they could start talking again. We didn't get as far as putting the framework in that time. So I have to remember, and I've been giving myself a bit of a reminder in recent months. I have to remember that although I do know what will work very often, when I hear certain complaints, it's pretty obvious what the starting point is, but not always. And I have to be cautious that maybe something different in my kit bag will be more suitable on this occasion. So yeah, it is. I don't want to sound like I only run roles and accountabilities exercises, because I don't. I can handle whatever comes up, but yeah, the lack of a clear framework, I think, causes friction between people, and sometimes you can't. On that occasion, probably I did do it, but mostly you can't sort the friction out unless you sort the framework out first. And it's in the organizational part of the business that you don't have a framework. Usually on the operational side, the principle of having effective processes and thinking through who the customers and suppliers are is fairly well sorted out. But on the people side, it isn't.
I love that example. It's it sounded like an amazing session, and quite challenging.
I've got to admit a certain relish. I quite like doing those sessions, because it's nice. I mean, I hate seeing people at odds with each other, and the vast majority of people don't go to work to get angry and bitch and backbite with each other. They really don't. So something had gone badly wrong there. There were a lot of personal issues in that company as well. So
the truth is, you need to tease it out, right? Because that's often, I've done a few of those sessions when you're looking at even product development, and you realise unless you get the team communicating honestly with each other, you're never going to win. And it teases out a lot of why they're stuck often or not.
But people are very what's the word? Task driven in the modern world, and. Some years ago, I used to run this business with my husband, and we used to go in much more often because there was more time and more money spent on development work, especially in the bigger companies we worked with then. And we used to just go in and say, we will help you sort out the communications issues in your team. But actually, British people in particular aren't very happy with that. It all feels a bit too kind of touchy-feely, woolly, fluffy, group huggy. So we started doing these these frameworks for developing roles and accountabilities and meeting structures and how to hold effective meetings and so on. And we discovered that they make a really good Trojan horse for allowing the people stuff and the emotional entanglements to come out and gently evaporate, or at least to come out and be dealt with in a structured environment. So I've got to the stage now where I prefer to have a framework to start with, because it's easier to get in front of people. You don't have to frighten them by saying you're going to have to talk about who you trust and who you don't trust. That's not an easy conversation. Might be in some countries, but it isn't in Britain. We're very reticent about stuff like that.
So a really important part of what you're doing is kind of untangling, and helping resolve tensions and frictions that exist. And I think, even going back to our, we've all had, large corporate experience, but there are often tensions between very well-established departments with very clearly defined roles, right? So, in my kind of finance world, a typical one is, for example, between the accounts receivable team that's collecting cash from customers and the sales team, who and actually what I guess I'm trying to say is that even in a well-established business with clear goals and responsibilities, tensions and frictions still exist. Yes. So if you kind of look at smaller businesses where you've got much more of this entangled kind of combined roles, less clarity, etc., then there's a lot of power that can be unlocked by solving these things. So yes. I definitely see the power and value in that.
Yeah, back in the day when we worked with bigger companies, we often were working with departmental issues like that. The marketing team didn't think the sales team was doing its job and vice versa. And we'd get them together and have these conversations between departments. And now, in smaller organizations, it's between a couple, just two different roles, or because everything's much leaner and more tightly staffed now.
We're nearing the end now, Kate. What's next for you in terms of what you're looking for next, where you're taking what you're doing next?
I think, interestingly, over the years, since, as I say, I've worked in this field for a very long time. I've gone from, 5-day offsites in comfortable country hotels to 3-day programs to 2-day programs to, well, we could maybe take a day to do something on this. Everything's leaner, tighter, more pared down. And I'm in a smaller market now. I'm working with smaller companies. One of the things I would like to do for myself, and I don't know how possible it is, but it would fit with my philosophy of pushing accountability down to people, is to do less of the leading of it myself. So I'm working with a company at the moment in London. There's only 11 of them in the company. This is the one where the founder is leaving in 2 or 3 years' time. So essentially, we've got 5 of them have become the management team and 5 of them are still working on the shop floor, so to speak. They haven't got the budget or the time to take time out of the business for me to take them into a training room somewhere and give them the whole background and the whole structure and do it the way I've always done it. So I would really like to make this stuff more available in some way to business owners that I work with. Now, there are certain things I think where my time is best used. So you could save me for the moments when there was a real friction between somebody and they couldn't do it without a referee present, or where they didn't have somebody with the potential to be a good facilitator, for example. Yeah. But if they have, then maybe I should be pushing the opportunity to work on those things down to the clients I work with. So making it more accessible and more of a mix of remote, on-site, me leading, them leading, give them a chance to have a go and maybe send it to me for my comments. So make the whole thing a much more flexible feast. I don't know how possible that's going to be, but that's my thinking at the moment.
Exciting.
And it would enable me to help more companies as well,
Yeah.
and be more affordable and accessible to smaller organisations as well, which is where I see the real need is.
Really good. So, Ramesh, what's your perspective on Kate's discussion?
Really interesting, Kate. Thank you so much. I think what we've talked about today is that all businesses have different phases, right? Stages, and it requires careful management, going through what people are doing, why they're doing it, and how to clearly define where those lines of communication are and where those responsibilities are. So that's a real takeaway from me. I've loved your insights on how to handle, for example, a challenging pushback in a session there. Brilliant story, Kate. But yeah, there's just so much to learn from this process. So thank you.
Yeah, I think for me, Kate, what I like is I've seen a lot of founders looking for mentors. And I think, how am I going to extract my business? How am I going to extract from a business from a mentor perspective? And I think where you're coming at it differently is you're looking at how the team collectively address that kind of evolution of the business, whether it's a founder exit or whether it's a founder role evolution. It doesn't matter really. It's that kind of ability to do it as a collective organisation is much more effective, I think.
Yes, they can help each other. They can help.
Yeah.
The team can help the founder let go.
Yeah.
The founder's often locked into a feeling of, I've got to do this all by myself. They don't.
Yeah.
They don't even have to get out of it all by themselves. They can be helped.
Yeah, brilliant.
So it's building a partnership with that team and its founder.
Excellent.
But thank you both very much for the opportunity. I've really
Lovely
enjoyed
to
the
you.
conversation. It was great.
Oh, we've thoroughly enjoyed it, Kate. So
Yeah.
listen, thank you. We'd like to thank everyone for listening or watching, and we hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we have. Big thank you again to Kate, and it's been there've been a lot of learnings from this, from my perspective, and I'm sure for Mike's as well. Strive and Thrive is a regular series of discussions for entrepreneurs and business leaders, and we have a great pipeline of interesting people to share their insights with you. Our next session will be in a couple of weeks, and we'll share some details on social media soon. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd be super grateful if you could like, follow, and subscribe to our Strive and Thrive YouTube and Spotify channels. We're on video and on podcast. And finally, a big thanks to Mike. Thanks for co-hosting, Mike. Again, good discussion. And the rest of the Strive and Thrive team. See you all soon.
Thanks, Kate. Lovely to meet you.
Thank you for listening to Strive and Thrive.